Kia ora koutou. My name is Paul Blair. I'm the CEO of Infrastructure New Zealand, and I'd like to welcome you to our 8th webinar in this post-COVID lockdown era. So today we're talking about the electrification of our economy. What will it take and how fast will it go? So thank you for joining us today. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'll quickly go through how we're going to run this today. You'll see from the agenda there that we've got some fantastic speakers. We're going to rush through those fairly quickly in order to get through to spend the majority of our time in the Q&A at the back. You'll all be absolute Zoom whiz kids by now, but please use the question and answer panel. Within that, there is the opportunity for you to like and therefore upweight questions in the Q&A. And when we get to the back end, that'll be very helpful for me in picking those most popular questions to put through to our panel. The chat function is disabled. We have I think about 400 of you registered today. So I hope you sit back, think some great questions up, and we really get into it. On behalf of Infrastructure New Zealand, it's now my great pleasure to welcome the Honourable Dr. Megan Wood. Dr. Wood was with us on a housing seminar recently as one of her many portfolios, but today she'll be giving us a brief introduction to what the opportunities are in this complex situation around electrification and decarbonisation of our economy. It is a huge opportunity for New Zealand and one that we sort of need to figure out how we're collectively going to seize that opportunity and go forward with it. So, Minister, I'd love to hand over to you for your opening address now. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And Paul, thank you very much for that introduction. And to Transpower, to Alison, to you and the team for inviting me to speak today. The work that Transpower has done here, but has been doing for a long time, has been hugely important. And this work in Whakamana e te Maro Hiko, the latest iterations really offers some really valuable insights into the role that our energy systems can play in decarbonisation. And I think there are some huge opportunities. You talked about that, Paul, and I think that it's really important that we have a well thought out roadmap of where those opportunities are and a plan as a country for where those opportunities are. Because of course now we're looking at everything we do in the context of this global pandemic that's sitting before us. While the economic impact of COVID on industry has been intense, we remain committed to transitioning our economy to more affordable, renewable, low emissions energy. That hasn't changed. And I believe meeting our climate goals and accelerating economic recovery go hand in hand. We expect that growth in electricity demand, particularly due to electrification of industry and transport, will remain a driving force behind renewable energy investment decisions. New technologies will certainly play a role. For example, hydrogen production can create export opportunities for us and enable further utilisation of our renewable electricity resources. As Whakamana e te Maro Hiko highlighted, timely access to well-functioning transmission and distribution networks will play a key role in all of this. Getting our policy settings right will be key. So today what I'm going to talk to you about in the time that I have is a highlights of the work we are doing to accelerate the uptake of renewable energy and support energy efficiency, discuss the role we see for new technology and how we can support its integration into our electricity system, and touch on how the electricity price review supports us as affordability as an important part of this transition. So we released the Accelerating Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency discussion document back in December 2019. And that does seem, I think, given the events that we've been through since December 2019, like an absolute age ago. This work forms a key piece of our renewable energy strategy work program to support the transition to a low emissions economy. This ambitious paper outlined a broad range of policy ideas, and officials are now putting together a package of policy options following that consultation. I'm immensely grateful that we did get that work underway in December last year. Having lived 10 years in a city that has had to recover from a disaster, and Rod, I see you're on the call as well. I think one of the key things that we learned that actually plans and strategies that were formed in peacetime are a good place to start accelerating when it comes to recovery and moving into recovery modes. So the fact that we already had a strategic basis for what we're thinking about now, I think is going to put us in a very good position. One area of consideration is policy settings to ensure transmission connections can be provided in a timely manner to support new renewable investment. We're looking to strengthen national direction for renewable energy activities under the Resource Management Act. And we're already starting to see results from our commitment to transformational energy policy. For example, we've worked with Fonterra on low emissions projects, including the co-fired wood energy at Nelson site. We've co-funded Synlait to install New Zealand's first large-scale electrode boiler. As a government, we are demonstrating leadership in lowering emissions. In January, we announced $200 million of funding to decarbonise and begin some decarbonisation work within the state sector. The first projects include environmentally friendly boilers in schools and hospitals, and further projects will be announced soon. The role of innovation and new technologies will also be critical to our future energy system, and government support will be important. We've invested $20 million in renewable energy research, and ECA's Low Emissions Vehicle and Technology Demonstration Fund enables businesses to trial new technologies and contribute to technology diffusion. Hydrogen has exciting potential to decarbonise parts of our economy that will be difficult to electrify. Green hydrogen also provides a future export opportunity for New Zealand. We've signed a memorandum of cooperation with Japan to explore potential opportunities from hydrogen and the development of an export market. And there are also other countries in the region who are interested in talking to us about opportunities. In light of current events, it is crucial that we continue to focus on affordability and equity in the energy sector. The Electricity Price Review recommended several improvements to the regulatory system for electricity. And as a result, the government is acting to improve consumer advocacy and to reduce energy hardship. We are drafting legislation recommended by the review that will help ensure emerging markets enabled by distributed energy technologies like batteries can operate as openly and as effectively as possible. And a bill will be ready for introduction later this year. Overall, we want to ensure that we have the right regulatory and policy settings to allow the country to make the most of our renewable energy. We want to support our transition to a low emissions economy while keeping in mind the need for energy to be affordable and secure. And I appreciate the role that Whakamana e Te Māori Hiko can play in facilitating discussion and collaboration across different parts of the sector and in supporting us to achieve a future of a secure, affordable and renewable energy. Kia ora tātou.
Well, Minister, thank you very much for your comments. We really appreciate it. I know you're exceptionally busy at present, but there is a huge opportunity here. So thank you. And unfortunately, I know that you may need to take off shortly, but thank you for providing the backdrop for us for this important conversation.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for the opportunity to come on and have the discussion.
You're welcome. Thank you.
A member of my team is going to stay with you throughout.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. They'll get the tough questions later on then on your behalf.
Thank you.
So look, now it's my pleasure to pass on from the Minister and to introduce to you Alison Andrew. Alison is the CEO of Transpower, and she has provided a great leadership and her team through Whakamana i Te Māori Hiko, which is the second iteration of their strategic leadership in painting some scenarios around the electrification of New Zealand's economy. Overall, our electricity sector has been performing quite well, but I suppose it's been doing it in a scenario where it's been relatively linear and reasonably predictable. We're now moving into a world of scenarios increased risk and increased opportunity. So I think we'd all love to hear from you, Alison, in terms of how you're taking that uncertainty and that opportunity and bring it forward at speed, because this is a real opportunity for us. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Ena mana, ena reo, ena karanga maha o te wā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Minister, for your comments. And thanks also to Rod and Mark for agreeing to join us. In the panel today. And again, everyone, welcome to this discussion. I'm really pleased to be hosting this conversation today after some extremely turbulent months. Many of you will know we released our Whakamana i te Morihiko work in early April after our original launch was cancelled. And today, however, while COVID-19 continues to dominate our conversation, there remains a pressing need to keep the decarbonisation of our economy front and centre in the decisions of how we build back better. We can't afford to make decisions today that bake in yet more carbon emissions and take us further from the objective of a net carbon zero economy. And so while a global pandemic didn't feature in our analysis about New Zealand's energy future, ironically, we now believe our work to produce Whakamana i te Morihiko is even more relevant in the post-COVID environment than it was before. If we make the decision today to shift our transport sector and industrial heat processes off carbon-intensive fuels and onto electricity, we could create thousands of new jobs, meet our emissions targets, reduce average household energy bills by about 25% by 2035, improve the security of supply of energy, and improve our trade balance by reducing our reliance on imported fuels. And finally, we think we can create economic competitive advantage, improving our international brand and attracting international investors seeking green places to do business. We consider these benefits to be overwhelming. The question is, how do we get there? Our analysis says we're going to need 40 new grid-scale renewable generation projects and battery projects to be built by 2035. And to put that in context, that's as much new generation in the next 15 years as we've seen in the last 40. And Transpower is going to have to expand the capacity of the national transmission grid. And to do this, most importantly, means we'll need your support and your collaboration. We've now got a short video to play. It's going to play for just roughly 2 minutes.
In 2019, Aotearoa New Zealand committed to a net zero carbon economy. We can generate much of our electricity from renewable sources, so electrification has the potential to significantly decarbonise our economy. This renewable future is also the most affordable. The average household energy bill could be up to 25% lower in 2035. A resilient and responsive national grid remains a central enabling part of Aotearoa New Zealand's sustainable energy future. Taking electricity from where it is generated across our country to where it is used. Transpower owns, maintains and operates New Zealand's high voltage electricity network. We've been exploring the opportunities and challenges New Zealand will face in advancing electrification and reducing carbon emissions. We've called this work Whakamana i te Morihiko, empowering our energy future. It's about ensuring we make changes today to maintain our safe, secure and reliable supply of renewable energy as demand grows. Ensuring we can swiftly connect new sources of renewable generation to the national grid, bringing more electricity to homes and businesses. It's about continuing to power your community as the number of electric vehicles grows and more industries use electricity for process heat. It's about making sure we have the right policy and regulation in place while creating jobs as we continue to build a strong New Zealand economy. Our desire to share this work and collaborate is driven by our vision that working together is the most efficient way we can electrify our economy. So lend your voice and join the conversation today.
What we've learned over the last 3 years is that New Zealand is facing the most significant social, environmental and economic opportunity in recent generations. And this is the opportunity ahead of us now to transform our economy and create thousands of highly skilled jobs through switching our energy consumption away from fossil fuels to clean, renewable electricity. By 2050, we believe electricity could become around 58% of New Zealand's total energy use. That's up from 25% today. And we also believe we can meet the 100% renewable electricity, meaning that 58% of energy use is from renewable electricity by 2050. Before I continue, it's worth addressing the elephant in the room, COVID-19. We've been questioned about our assumptions of growth and the impact COVID will have. Our predictions are that by 2050, electricity demand could increase by 70%, driven by electrification rather than base growth. Energy efficiency is the reason we don't see any major increases in the base growth. And there's a real question, will COVID depress this growth? In level 2 lockdown, electricity demand, both peak and gross, was interestingly 3% higher than for the corresponding period in 2019. So while we are experiencing significant economic uncertainty, this is yet to hit electricity demand. What's interesting will be the pace of growth. We're forecasting relatively flat growth in demand to 2025, and based on technology trends and increasing carbon prices, the economics for electrification become very compelling from 2025, and this is where we see a real ramp up in demand. Overall, we believe the signals to be strong and clear. In order to meet our net carbon zero target, we must electrify the economy, and this will significantly increase electricity demand. We think it's a simple fact, and we stand by our forecast. Where's this growth in electricity going to come from? Across the transport sector, we see potential here for, let me just pull my slides up here. 60% of energy used to be electricity, which is equivalent to 13% of New Zealand's total energy use, up from 0% today. There's electric cars, buses, rails and trucks. The technology exists and it's rapidly developing. We're estimating New Zealand's going to have around 1.5 million electric vehicles by 2035. So moving our transport from oil to electricity will save us all money and improve our trade balance. We currently import as a country around 60 million barrels of crude oil or oil-based fuels every year. So shifting to electricity will make our economy more profitable and resilient. For industry and the primary industries, we see the potential for 46% of energy used to be electricity, up from 11% today, using clean electricity rather than gas or coal to heat schools, hospitals, and for the likes of drying milk. It's also interesting to see the actual overall use of energy. So we're seeing that New Zealand's overall energy demand to increase by a quarter from nearly 160 terawatt hours today in 2020 to 120, or decrease, I beg your pardon, to 120. You might say, well, how does that going to work? So even as the economy is forecast to expand by 80%, it's because electrical energy can be significantly more efficient than the fossil fuel alternatives. If we look at the impact electrification could have on meeting our emissions reduction targets, it's significant. Potentially 55% of the non-forestry reductions needed to meet our 2050 net carbon zero target. And so while electrification can contribute significantly to our target, we also need forestry and other renewable fuel sources such as biomass, hydrogen, biogas, direct geothermal heat and biofuels to deliver abatement if we are going to meet our targets. We think decarbonising our economy is also going to cut our energy bills. Renewable electricity is already the cheapest form of energy, and modelling suggests that an average household with one electric vehicle could see their total energy bill fall by a quarter by 2035. Also, building this low carbon economy is going to transform our workforce, requiring around 40 new grid scale renewable electricity generation and battery projects to be built by 2035. It's going to require massive investment in installing domestic scale solar and battery projects on our houses and major upgrades of our transmission system. So this is going to require many thousands of highly skilled workers in the long term, high paying and within long term with high paying jobs over the next 15 years. Research just published by Oxford University confirms that green recoveries deliver more jobs and more growth. So what needs to change to deliver this future? We have the resources, we have the technology, and we're increasingly clear on what needs to change for us to realise the opportunity. However, on the other hand, emissions are still higher than they were a decade ago, and we're running out of time to meet climate targets, and we don't yet have the right plan. We need a plan, and we need to get moving. We've identified an action plan of 10 components that include improved planning, policy reform, new markets, and a focus on workforce development. Most critically, it requires collaboration. We all need to rise to this challenge. And my message today is simple. In order for us to meet the climate change commitments, we must electrify our transport and industry sectors. If we don't do this, we will fail. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. That's fantastic to get some of those facts out. And as I said, a very complex system. So it's great to have a roadmap for some of the possibilities there. I note that the Aotearoa Circle had the Fenwick Forum recently. I think Dr. Carr was part of that. And we also had Vision Week recently. Both of those fora looking into New Zealand's future both came down to electrification being one of the critical opportunities for New Zealand to find its way, not just to refloat the economy, but also decarbonise it. So I think it'll be fascinating hearing from our next speaker, Dr. Rod Carr. So Dr. Carr has owned the Reserve Bank in his time, been the governor, been the acting governor, been the chair, the original chair of the National Infrastructure Advisory Board, a number of roles at Canterbury University, but now leading the interim, from the interim to the Climate Change Commission. So our independent expert in how we're going to get this path going. So Dr. Carr, a warm welcome to you. And I think for me, my question to you is, Alison's provided some fantastic head facts, I would say. What is the heart view and what is going to prompt us to actually get on with it and be reasonably bold in this space?
Kia ora, Paul. Kora Rod Karaho. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to all of you. Without going straight to that question, Paul, let me start by just reminding everybody, because I'm sure many know, what the role of the Commission is. So the Commission is not all things climate change. The Commission has, under the Act, certain responsibilities and gives focus to that. The Commission is an independent, expert, evidence-based advisory group to the government of the day. And our work plan consists of developing emissions budgets that would be consistent with our domestic targets of net zero by 2050 for all but biogenic methane and the reduction in biogenic methane by 24 to 47%. And also consistent with our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So we have to develop a series of budgets or forecasts. To do that, you need to get an estimate of where you are today, and that requires widespread consultation and engagement with New Zealanders at the front line of action in communities around the country to develop that understanding, and also to understand what is going to happen anyway, irrespective of advice that we might give or actions that might arise from that advice. Then we look at the gap between what we think will happen and what we believe needs to happen in order to get to our targets. To do that, we need to develop pathways which have regard to the matters in the Act about distributional impacts, about an inclusive, resilient society. And we present those pathways in the form of not only budgets, but plans to give effect to those pathways. We put that information out for consultation before the government of the day receives that advice and determines what they're going to do. That advice was originally legislated to be delivered to the government of the day by the 1st of February 2021. It's probably no secret, but as a consequence of COVID, many of the organisations that we need to consult with to understand the starting point and their work in hand have been delayed. However, the government is committed to making decisions on the timeline that would see the first 3 budgets for 2025, 2030, 2035, and the emissions reduction plan adopted by the end of 2021. So, where does electrification fit into all of that? The interim committee on climate change under David Prentice produced a report on accelerating electrification. And the Commission has inherited that body of work and many of the staff who are involved in preparing it. It's not unreasonable, therefore, to assume that we will conclude that electrification represents a significant opportunity for New Zealand to address its targets in a timely, resilient, and inclusive manner. Of course, there will be stumbles on the way. How will we access global markets for all those EVs that we think we're going to buy when the rest of the world is also buying them? How will we make sure that the 40 major projects at the generation end of the grid are put in place in an orderly and timely manner? How will we ensure that the capital is provided to make sure that where the power is generated, it can be moved to where it is needed? Those questions will be part not just of the advice the Commission gives, but the advice and decisions made by the many actors in the New Zealand economy. But rest assured, expanding our electricity generation through new renewable sources and making sure that that energy is available for the electrification of ground transportation and increasingly the prospect of near-shore marine and short-haul flight will be real parts of how New Zealand can address and reduce its emissions. But we do need to manage the risk. The reality is that our dry year hydro risk is real. And a system needs to be reliable and stable, as well as cost-effective and efficient, low emission and resilient. We'll therefore need to reach conclusions as a country about the trade-off between the capital intensity, emissions intensity, and environmental impacts of all of these decisions that need to be made. There is no free lunch here. We cannot have it all. We simply cannot say, don't stop the water moving, don't build a wind turbine near me, don't put solar panels on my neighbour's roof, and electrify all that we can. So the Climate Change Commission's work has barely begun, but it does include recognising that price alone cannot drive the extent and rate of change that we need. That price through the ETS will play a part, but will also have some unintended consequences. Black letter regulation must also play its part, but regulation can sometimes be clumsy and sometimes alienate those who are regulated. And changing preferences is also critical. Young people often ask me, what can I do? I'm not a business leader. I'm not an elected politician. I'm not a business owner. What can I do now to change things? And I reply by giving them 4 things they can all do, that we can all do. The first is I remind them that every time we buy something, we are voting for more of that thing. The supply chain will fill the empty shelf with what was on it when we bought it. Make sure that every dollar you spend is a vote for the future you want. Secondly, all of us are advocates. We're able to tell stories, engage our families and friends. and we need advocacy to build the political will to make hard choices. It's also clear that many are employees and businesses and can influence business leaders to make choices consistent with a low emission and resilient society. And I remind them, at least those of voting age, that you all get to vote, and we will get the leaders we choose. And if you want leaders who will lead us to a low emission, resilient and inclusive future, then you need them to understand that that matters to you. Looking forward to the panel discussion, but Paul, from the heart, I sincerely believe that we must act now. The we as you and me and all of us, for tomorrow will be too late.
Fantastic way to finish. Thank you very much, Rod. And I think that's the tone of a number of the questions beforehand. But also there's a lot of, it will be them or not us. So I think those 4 points around consumer preference, advocacy, the influence of business leaders and your votes are a great 4 things to live by. So if Tara is sitting there in the background, what I might do is I might actually, just before I introduce our next speaker, introduce a very quick poll. So Tara, if you could bring that further forward for us. Perfect. So this poll is going to force you to make some choices. All of these choices are possible, but I want you to make one choice. What is the one choice that would have the biggest impact and start moving this further forward? So you need to choose option 1, consumers reducing personal emissions. Option 2, generators moving away from fossil fueled power plants. Number 3, car manufacturers changing to EVs. Or number 4, farmers reducing agricultural emissions. And number 5, government incentivising emission changes. So unfortunately, host and panelists can't vote here, so I'll just rely on you, Sally, because I can't see how far through we are. So if you could let me know when we are through that and have a result, that would be good.
We're 65% of the way through.
It's a difficult choice, people, but we're going to force you to take one of those buckets. How are we looking?
We're 75%.
All right, we'll tell you what, we'll wait until 80, and then that's my final offer. Sort of like selling a house here at auction.
And there we go, 80%.
Perfect. All right, Tara, the big reveal, if we could have a look. What's the one thing that we need to do? And not too surprisingly there, it's government. 43% of us say that government need to lead. Closely followed, probably equal actually, 16% farmers reducing agricultural emissions, 15% consumers. So I think to Dr. Carr's perspective, there's a multitude of ways to get there, but I suppose this is a pretty clear call for government to lead the incentivisation of this change. So thanks very much for that, Tara. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mark England, our next speaker. So Mark is the Chief Executive of Genesis Energy. He's been with Genesis since 2016 as the CEO. Prior to that was the EGM for New Energy at AGL in Australia. And prior to that, working for British Gas in the UK. So Mark has got that interesting position of being a generator and facing consumers and dealing with a really interesting mix. So Mark, welcome to the panel. Would love to hear your perspectives. Over to you. Thank you. You're on mute, by the way.
Tēnā koutou, Paul, and thank you for that introduction. I'm glad you mentioned a little bit more history for me too, to put it in perspective. So I've been through various turns in my career, and for the last 4 years landed at Genesis Energy, where, as most people listening will know, we've got 3 hydro schemes generating electricity around New Zealand, but also the largest thermal plant in the market. And so in some ways, we believe that gives us insight into how this transition needs to work and what some of the challenges and constraints are around it. We've also got a lot of customers that consume that energy. So thank you, Dr. Carr, Rod Carr, for your piece. I was encouraged by what you said, because we certainly feel in the sector, as a participant in the sector, that there are no free lunches, that there are some difficult choices to make. But if we make the right ones with the right intent for New Zealand, we will get the right outcomes, and we're definitely minded to do that. And so I think I'll explain a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. And also thank you, Alison, for taking the lead here. I think, you know, the last year and more, you've taken the lead by putting this strategy out there, challenging the thinking and getting groups of us together to debate it. So well done for showing leadership in the sector. So as a participant in the sector, I thought the best thing I could do, rather than repeat everything everyone said, because I largely agree with it all, is just to give you our perspective and maybe put on the table before the Q&A some of the trade-offs that I see and some of the challenges that I see. I also want to create a couple of distinctions. And the first one is, we often get confused, and fortunately none of the speakers have in this session, of the difference between energy and electricity. And they often get muddled together because they both begin with E and they sound similar. But New Zealand has this wonderful renewable electricity system, but we're not that renewable for energy as a whole. And some of the stats that Alison put out there show that. And so the opportunity clearly is to electrify more broadly across the energy sector if we get it right. The other distinction I want to make is between base load thermal plant and backup thermal plant. And I'll tell you briefly what Genesis is doing about it, but also to give you one stat you probably haven't heard, which is in New Zealand today, although we're 85% renewable, the electricity sector contributes 4% of New Zealand's emissions roughly. About 2/3 of those emissions are base load thermal. So they are pretty much always on units that are running 24/7 roughly to keep lights on in New Zealand. About 1/3 of the emissions relate to backup thermal, which back up the very volatile hydro system, and it'll increasingly over time also a greater wind system. So in Genesis, we actually have a strategy to displace baseload thermal over the next few years. And we expect to take out about 2,500 gigawatt hours of energy from baseload thermal and convert it to renewables. The first cab off the rank is the Waipipi wind farm that you may have heard we partnered with Tilt Renewables on. There are more projects that we're bringing into the pipeline, and our view is that baseload thermal generation has had its day in New Zealand, and there will be no new baseload thermal plants built. And that's really good news, because that's 2/3 of the current emissions pie, that small 4% slither that electricity contributes. But it's going to become increasingly economical to displace that with renewable sources, a mixture of geothermal, wind, and some solar too. So that's the good news. The challenge we have as a sector, and Rod alluded to this, is that we have a limited amount of hydro storage. And in our market, which is different to many other markets around the world, the largest consumption for electricity happens in winter, when we've got the least amount of water flowing into the lakes. And we have what we call roughly about 4,000 gigawatt hours of storage in our lakes, but about a 3,000 gigawatt hour gap in winter that we need to fill. And some of that will be filled by new renewables. But the challenge we have, and we believe at Genesis, for the foreseeable future, I'm not talking 2050 in Alison's timeframe, but certainly for the next 10 years, it's very hard to see how technologies are going to be able to provide a backup thermal alternative. And so at Genesis, we feel we have to make the case for that backup thermal. And you'll hear us making that case publicly, like now, but in other times too, but also saying, but don't worry, we're also decarbonising by taking 2/3 of our emissions out by building and contracting for more renewables over the same time frame. And we believe that backup thermal will remain important for the next 10 plus years in order to enable the decarbonisation of the energy sector more broadly that Alison and Rod have both talked about. So it really is a unique challenge for New Zealand. And one of the things that bothers me, having worked in the UK and Australia and here, is I often hear a narrative growing here that really relates to other markets. And one of my cautions is we've got to be very careful that we don't let ourselves talk about New Zealand's energy market in the same narrative that others are using in other countries, because we are very different. We have this unique position, highly renewable already for electricity, an opportunity to become more renewable in energy more broadly, but we have this challenge around hydro storage and the need to back the system up. Most of you listening, because you're interested in our sector, will have heard about the trilemma, And ultimately, what we're ultimately trying to achieve here is a low carbon, low cost, reliable electricity system that will enable that decarbonisation too. Beyond that, my view is we need to, and Alison touched on some of this, we need to work collaboratively and with government to make sure we unlock some of the barriers to electrification. There are more barriers out there than get acknowledged. Some of them around connecting wind farms and RMA consents and various other things, but some of them are also about connecting businesses to the grid and the cost of doing that, the first mover disadvantages, the hurdles around the cost of EVs. And I think if we focus on that more than whether we'll build the next wind farm or the next geothermal plant or the next solar plant, but we focus on how do you enable demands to electrify, the supply will come quite quickly with it, and it'll be a solution that works for New Zealand. So with that, I'll end my bit and open up for Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Mark. Sort of the energy trilemma going to the energy dodecahedron by the sound of it. So thank you for trying to simplify that for us. So we've now got probably about 15 minutes or so to go through some Q&A. So what I'll do is I'll engage the whole panel and throw it out there. The first question that's coming to the top is from Phil Donnelly, and it's around, is the government considering a simplified Resource Management Act process, similar to what came through the recent stimulus package, to ensure these essential energy projects don't get bogged down in bureaucracy? And I reckon, Alison, that's probably the first one for you, actually.
Yeah, we've highlighted that the harassment challenges around the RMA, it's a complicated area of legislation, as people know, and the government is doing some fast-track legislation with some plans to help across the first couple of years. So the government is considering this and they are consulting on it, and we think that actually changes to the RMA are really, really important. There's a plethora of NPS's, national policy statements, and all competing in different hierarchies, and actually just putting some clarity and simplicity into that system while still making sure we really preserve the really important pieces of the RMA. It's a really important piece of reform, and the government is consulting on it now.
Fantastic, thank you. So one for you, Dr. Carr. So coming from Louise Tong, carbon prices have risen recently, but not enough to bridge the gap to make the business case for electrification, even if you forecast carbon price increases. Given the capital intensive nature of electrification, how should businesses think about bridging that gap? And you're on mute there, Dr. Carr.
Okay. Look, the starting point is to recognise that the ETS and carbon pricing, while a very useful instrument, can only ever be one of the instruments that we need to incentivise and reward the decarbonising of the economy. And the reason for that is that it is serving a number of purposes. It's trying to put a price on both the removal of carbon, largely through forestry, and the choice of alternatives to adding to gross emissions. At about $50 in NZU, the Ministry for the Environment model that the lowest decile households in New Zealand will pay about $2 a week more for their energy, and the highest decile households about $3.40 a week more. That will all pay about 6 cents a litre more for petrol. Nobody seriously believes that that's going to materially change behaviours at households or even choice of vehicle at that point. But what we know is at $50 in NZU, some sheep land will be forested perpetually. That at that point, the energy generators are facing sufficient incentives to change their profile of generation. So I think that when we come to a question about how much can we rely on the ETS to do the work, the answer is we can assume it will do some of the work, but we cannot rely on it to do all of the work. So we are going to have to think about other regulations. For example, we really don't want to become the world's dumping ground for obsolete, high emission internal combustion engine cars. That would be terribly foolish. Yep. So that may mean that the case should be made for emissions regulations from ICEs, both at the time of import and it's easier to impose that because they're not here already, and for keeping them on the road over time. That's one element.
Yeah, fantastic. So thanks very much for that. Mark, a question for you coming in from John Irving at the World Bank. Part of the system that we haven't talked about is the distribution, the lines companies. And controversially, he's asked, when will New Zealand introduce an electricity storage market managed by the distributors that would enable privately owned PV to compete with your good selves in the gentailers?
Well, I can't say when, but I can say should they. And, you know, I think it comes back to a point Rod made earlier around the economics. What we're trying to achieve here in this transition is to keep costs down. Distributed storage with solar is not yet a viable solution from a cost perspective. And if you look at which countries have adopted it fastest, it's generally been heavily incentivized or subsidized. So I'm not sure that's the right solution for New Zealand. I am a believer in PV on rooftops in the sense that I think it should contribute to some of the demand growth and some of the need to fulfill that over the next few decades. But distributors might use it for a bit of demand response, but it's not an economic choice right now.
Right, fantastic. Coming back to you, Alison, what lessons is Transpower taking from Australia and with respect to integrating the more intermittent renewable generation? They've had a few issues in the market over there. What lessons is Transpower picking up from Australia?
Lots of lessons. It's wonderful to have a market so close we know relatively well, giving us lots of lessons for what to do and what not to do as much. We are very, very fortunate in New Zealand in that we have a lot of big rotating plant in our hydro and geothermal, so a lot of inertia in our system, and that's renewable. So when we add, we actually have the capacity to absorb a lot of intermittent renewables, wind and solar, because of the benefit of this big rotating plant that we already have. There's a great inertia in our system. As system operator, we've done a number of market studies talking about how much wind, how much intermittent generation we could absorb before there is a problem. And we actually have capacity to absorb quite a lot. So we're very lucky we have time. And it's just wonderful to be able to watch these markets, get the lessons learned, and make sure we take them over into our market. So yes, we watch them very closely and other markets, but we are lucky.
Yeah. Fantastic. Hopefully a better question for you this time, Mark. A question coming in from Russell Hawken at GHD. To what extent can existing generation sources be upgraded or retrofitted to increase their efficiency and outputs? Is that part of our solution or not?
Well, look, generators like us are always doing that. You know, we invest a fair amount of capex each year into increasing the efficiency of our units. So whenever we see opportunities, we do. But it's not going to be material to the overall demand growth we need to maintain here, or need to match here. So that's not really the solution, but I mean, everyone can rest assured, I think it's been touched on already, there is no shortage of renewable resources in New Zealand to meet demand. And that's why I make the point that we really need to unlock some of the blockers to electrification. The demand, the supply to meet that demand will follow without too much trouble.
Excellent. And for Dr. Carr, is the Climate Change Commission taking into account the phenomenon of energy descent, the declining net energy from fossil fuels towards renewables, which have an even lower net energy? I hope you understand that one.
I am not going to be claiming to be a technical expert on the chemistry of fossil fuels, but I am going to take the liberty of very quickly saying, at the moment, our pathway through renewables, particularly for the replacement of petrol and diesel and ground transportation, is held hostage to the international price of oil. That there is always going to be an end game in oil where a barrel left in the ground is worthless. And so the incentive in the end game is to pump as fast as you can, even if it's at a very low realized price. New Zealand needs to make a strategic decision not to get caught in that vortex. It will destroy our pathways to renewables under normal market incentives. And the case needs to be made that we should stabilize at a high price, the retail price of petrol.
Excellent. It's actually a question for me, so I'll have a crack at this. I've got a question coming in from Richard White around reforming New Zealand building code for higher quality passive housing. Why are we not doing that? I can very simply say that I think that absolutely is part of the solution. We've got, I think, 500,000 homes in New Zealand that are cold and mouldy. There are 1,600 deaths per annum, unfortunately, in New Zealand that are directly attributable to poor quality housing. Housing is a priority for Infrastructure New Zealand. And I think there's a win-win here, but I think that we need to be quite smart. So I think that people like ECA and so on have got a part to play here, but also we've been very, very slow in reforming our Building Act. I think that that's absolutely part of the future. So one back for you, Mark. We're a small country. This is coming in from Mark Verbeest at Meridian. We're a small country. How could we consolidate our own demand to get the attention of suppliers? For example, should we push for the government vehicle fleet to go all electric as an example? How do we consolidate demand?
I think there's probably two parts to that. I mean, there has been an attempt by some large businesses in New Zealand to group together and buy a renewable package and to engage renewable developers. I think the challenge with that issue is it's very hard for large businesses to commit to a multi-year PPA, which is effectively what it might be to underwrite that, and that's become problematic. On the other point around EVs, I mean, I think Mark's team will be saying this in Meridian, absolutely, the government need to show leadership. It's almost criminal that they haven't at this stage already done that and demonstrated, putting their money where their mouth is, if you like, and made all company or all government cars EVs. There is a cost to it, but what you need to get an EV market working is second-hand EVs to fall into the system, and there's no better way to do that or to accelerate that than to get the government to put the new cars in first. So we're a big fan of that, and I think a lot of us in the sector are trying to push it, but it hasn't happened very quickly.
Fantastic. So a question for you again, Dr. Carr. So coming in from Louise Tong, does the Climate Change Commission have a dollar figure or range around the investment that's going to be required? And I'll help you out a little in that I think Alison's document talks about, I think, 8 to 12 billion roughly in the transmission and generation side. But do you have a view on the demand side as well about what this investment requirement is going to be to help us with electrification?
Not at this point, but you can begin to think of some numbers, and then the question is how much of that is the early obsolescence, in other words, a true real economic cost, as distinct from the replacement of old tech when it comes to the end of its useful life. The classic one being to early obsolete internal combustion engine cars before they fall to bits has a real economic cost and benefit. Equally, to take down coal-fired boilers before their end of their economic life in order to electrify gives you a cost and a benefit. So the true capital cost of the transformation of the New Zealand economy into a low emissions resilient economy will be in the tens of billions of dollars.
I think probably the opportunity is to look at that not as a cost, but as an investment, I think, is probably the mindset that we need to have a very close look at. So, Alison, we've got probably time for a final question, though you might want to share this one with Mark. Can you talk us quickly through, for Sandra Gamble from the Electricity Authority, this is like a gift coming early for Christmas, what regulatory barriers stand in the way of your major energy innovation? Just go to town.
There are a number of regulatory barriers, but I don't think that regulation, I think, should be trying to let the market work and remove the barriers and stopping things. We need to think about, particularly on the market side, what kind of markets are we going to need for the future? We're envisaging a interconnected system of millions of appliances, batteries, EV, solar, in networks in the system, and we need to make sure they're smart devices, that they can contribute and can participate in markets and get value for the services that they're offering. and that we have the right platforms that people can aggregate, can play, and they can, because if we can get this distributed system working and all these devices, we can avoid billions of dollars in building generation and networks to meet peak charges by flattening loads and making sure we're doing smart charges and things. So there are a number of regulatory constructs or rules or regulations we need just to make sure that we have, for instance, smart devices, regulations to make sure no one can plug something dumb into the grid, because then you lose the opportunity to avoid all those extra costs. That we can build these platforms and systems and enable new participants and things we haven't even thought about for people to come in and play in the market and get value for making a contribution. So a lot of this is about envisaging the future, thinking about what it needs to be and making sure we're removing those roadblocks that are in the way. On the other hand, we've talked about some of the big obvious things right in front of us, like the RMA reforms, to make sure that we can just get ahead and do these things. Mark talked about the first mover disadvantage, to make sure that we don't penalise people making the first moves, to make sure things like the grid investment test takes into consideration carbon pricing and climate change. So there is a whole package of things that we can do that just remove a lot of these barriers that are ahead of us. But regulators are going to have to think smartly and be envisaging what needs to be true and thinking about putting those mechanisms in place and removing those barriers.
I think one of the things in your document sort of talks about Elon Musk putting in a battery fleet in sort of 60 to 80 days or something. If we want to contrast that with what it takes for us to put something into the transmission grid, we're a long way off those settings. So
yeah, and Transpower is going to have to get more nimble and faster and be able to hook up these new players much more quickly than we can today. We're up for that challenge.
So look, I'm just conscious of time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let Alison take the final word here. But what I wanted to do is wanted to thank all of our attendees, and in particular our panellists, Mark England and Dr. Rod Carr, and also the Minister, who has now dropped off, unfortunately, so we don't have the ability to put questions back. But Alison, I think it's fantastic that Transpower has put some leadership out there to give us a strategic framework in a really complex space so that we can envisage the future. It's quite an exciting future, but I think what I want to do is I want to pass it over to you. What is it that we need to do to act now? What responsibilities do we have, each of us, in this complex system, and how is that going to make our lives better? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'll reiterate perhaps what I had talked about before, is that I think we're on the cusp in New Zealand of our most significant social, environmental and economic opportunity that we have in recent generations. And that's the opportunity to transform the economy and create thousands of highly skilled jobs if we switch our energy consumption off fossil fuels to clean, renewable electricity. The opportunity is there right now. We're at a very interesting time. The pandemic COVID is absolutely acute in our face today, and we must take action to deal with that, rebuild our economy. Climate change hasn't gone away. It's a chronic long-term problem, but it's just as impactful, if not more, and it's sitting out there. We have to take the opportunity to solve both problems at the same time. If we don't do that, we will be missing an enormously important opportunity. My children, your children, our grandchildren won't thank us for that. So we need to act now. We need to mobilise. We need to encourage government. We need to get all players working and collaborating. And a lot about Whakamana i te Morihiko is saying, let's have these conversations. Let's get people talking about this. This is an opportunity, and let's work together to make it happen. I'd just like to say thank you, Paul, too, for everybody participating today. Great to have everybody here. We can't see you, but thank you for being present, and thank you for your very insightful questions. And thank you very much to my fellow panel members for your excellent contributions.
And thank you very much, Alison. Again, well done for putting this sort of strategic leadership document out there so that we can sort of envisage that future and make sense of it. And so I think also Dr. Carr said it's a participation sport out there, so get involved yourself. Be remiss of me if I didn't say, if you're not already an Infrastructure New Zealand member, we'll be having our large hui, which is the Building Nations Conference, on the 14th and 15th of October. Very exciting to actually be face-to-face again. And discussions like this one that we've just had are going to be workshopped in quite some depth when we get together at Building Nations. So thank you for your participation. I'd encourage you to be part of our future because it is exciting. but it does require us to work together and get together in different ways. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again on another one of these.
Kia ora.
Yeah.